Captain Sarah Martinez pressed her helmet against the cool metal of her C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, watching the sun rise over the military airbase in Eastern Europe. The year was 1999, and tensions in the Balkans had reached a boiling point. What nobody knew was that this routine transport mission would become one of the most extraordinary aerial combat encounters in modern military history. Sarah had been flying transport missions for 8 years, ferrying supplies, equipment, and personnel across conflict zones. Her colleagues respected her flying skills, but, like most transport pilots, she was seen as a glorified bus driver in the sky. Fighter pilots got the glory, the recognition, and the respect. Transport pilots just moved things from point A to point B. The morning briefing was typical. Colonel Davidson, the base commander, outlined the mission parameters with his usual military precision. Martinez, you'll be flying medical supplies and communications equipment to forward operating base Delta. Intelligence suggests minimal enemy activity in the corridor, but stay alert. Weather conditions are favorable, and you should have clear skies for most of the journey. Sarah nodded, making notes on her flight chart. The route would take her through a narrow valley between two mountain ranges, a path that had been used safely dozens of times before. What the intelligence reports didn't mention was that Serbian forces had quietly moved a squadron of MiG-29 fighters into a hidden airfield just 20 miles from her planned route. As Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection, she noticed her crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, performing extra checks on systems that weren't normally part of the transport configuration. "What's with the additional equipment, Rodriguez?" she asked, running her hand along what appeared to be modified electronics housing. Rodriguez glanced around nervously before answering. "Classified upgrade, Captain. Some new defensive systems the brass wanted field-tested. Don't worry about it. Just fly your normal mission." What Rodriguez couldn't tell her was that her aircraft had been secretly equipped with an experimental defensive suite designed for a completely different type of aircraft. Sarah C-130 had been selected for a black project that combined advanced radar systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and, most surprisingly, a limited air-to-air engagement system. The military had been testing whether transport aircraft could be given defensive teeth without compromising their primary mission. Sarah's aircraft was the prototype, though she had no idea. The flight began normally. Sarah lifted off at 0800 hours, climbing steadily through scattered clouds toward her cruising altitude. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Johnson, was relatively new to transport operations, but eager to learn. "Captain, I've been wondering about those extra switches on the console. The manual doesn't cover them." Sarah had noticed the same thing, but assumed they were part of routine avionics upgrades. "Probably just new navigation aids. Johnson, focus on your checklist and radio procedures. We'll be over hostile territories soon, and I want everything by the book." As they approached the mountain corridor, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from their escort fighter, call sign Falcon 1. "Transport 77, we've got multiple bogies appearing on radar. Count 12 aircraft, possibly hostile, approaching from the northeast. We're moving to intercept, but you need to alter course immediately." Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She banked the heavy transport aircraft to the left, pushing the engines to maximum power. The C-130 wasn't built for evasive maneuvers, but Sarah had spent countless hours in the simulator practicing emergency procedures. "Johnson, give me a new course to base. Rodriguez, secure all cargo and prepare for possible combat maneuvering." The escort fighters, two F-16s, streaked ahead to engage the approaching enemy aircraft. Sarah watched through her cockpit window as the fighters disappeared into the distance, their contrails marking their rapid climb toward the threat. What she didn't know was that the enemy force was larger than initially reported, and her escorts were about to face overwhelming odds. "Transport 77, this is Falcon Leader," came a strained voice over the radio. "We're engaged with 8 bandits, but for more breaking through our line. They're headed directly for you. We can't break off to assist." Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized her situation. The modified C-130 was alone, carrying vital supplies and facing multiple enemy fighters. Everything in her training said to run, to use the transport's altitude, and hope the fighters would focus on more threatening targets. But as she looked at her instruments, those mysterious additional systems began to make sense. The radar display showed contacts approaching rapidly from multiple angles. These weren't just opportunistic attacks. The enemy pilots were coordinating their approach to trap her in the valley. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible minutes earlier. Instead of running, she was going to fight. Johnson, take the controls and maintain current heading. Rodriguez, I need you to access those classified systems we discussed earlier. Emergency Authorization Alpha 77 Delta. Sarah had no idea where those code words came from, but somehow she knew they were correct. Rodriguez looked stunned. Captain, those systems are experimental. We don't have authorization for combat deployment. We do now, Sarah replied, watching the enemy contacts close to within 10 miles. Either we use what we have, or we become target practice for those MiGs. The first enemy fighter appeared as a glint of metal in the morning sun, diving down from the mountains with clear intent to engage. Sarah's modified C-130 was about to be tested in ways its designers had never imagined, piloted by a woman who was about to prove that transport pilots could be every bit as dangerous as their fighter pilot counterparts. As the enemy fighter began its attack run, Sarah's hands moved across the unfamiliar controls with surprising confidence. The experimental systems hummed to life, and for the first time in aviation history, a transport aircraft prepared to engage multiple enemy fighters in single combat. The battle that followed would rewrite military aviation doctrine and prove that in the hands of an exceptional pilot, any aircraft could become a weapon. Sarah Martinez was about to show the world that being underestimated was the enemy's first and most critical mistake. The first MiG-29 screamed past Sarah's cockpit at over 400 miles per hour, its pilot clearly expecting an easy kill. What he encountered instead was a C-130 that suddenly wasn't behaving like any transport aircraft he'd ever seen. As the enemy fighter pulled up for another pass, Sarah activated systems that shouldn't have existed on her aircraft. The experimental defensive suite included adaptive radar jammers, chaff and flare dispensers positioned throughout the aircraft's frame, and, most surprisingly, for air-to-air missiles mounted in concealed pods. The weapons had been integrated so seamlessly that even experienced maintenance crews wouldn't notice them during routine inspections. Rodriguez, I'm reading weapons systems online, Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the impossible situation. Tell me you know how to operate the targeting computer. Captain, I helped install this equipment, but I never thought we'd actually use it in combat, Rodriguez replied, frantically consulting a manual he'd pulled from a sealed envelope. The system is designed to be intuitive, but you're going to have to learn on the job. The second enemy fighter was approaching from below, using the classic transport hunting technique of attacking from the aircraft's blind spot. The pilot assumed Sarah would continue flying straight and level, making his job simple. He was about to learn the first of several painful lessons about assumptions. Sarah rolled the massive transport into a banking turn that should have been impossible for an aircraft of its size and weight. The experimental modifications included enhanced control surfaces and improved hydraulic systems that gave the C-130 fighter-like maneuverability. The attacking MiG overshot its target, suddenly finding itself in front of the transport rather than behind it. Targeting lock achieved, Sarah announced, working controls she was learning by instinct. The heads-up display showed the enemy fighter centered in her targeting reticle. Fox 2, the AM-9 Sidewinder missile launched from its concealed pod, leaving a trail of white smoke as it tracked toward the surprised MiG pilot. The enemy aircraft attempted evasive maneuvers, but the missile's proximity fuse detonated close enough to shred the fighter's left wing. The first enemy aircraft spiraled toward the ground in flames. Transport 77, what was that? Came Falcon Leader's shocked voice over the radio. Did you just shoot down a MiG? Sarah didn't have time to explain. The remaining 3 fighters in the first wave had regrouped and were approaching in a coordinated attack pattern. Professional military pilots, They quickly adapted their tactics when they realized the transport wasn't defenseless. Multiple contacts, attack formation, Johnson reported, his voice tight with concentration. Captain, they're not going to underestimate us again. Sarah studied the tactical display, seeing the enemy fighters spreading out to attack from 3 different angles simultaneously. Standard evasive maneuvers wouldn't work against coordinated professionals. She needed to think like a fighter pilot while using the unique advantages of her aircraft. The C-130's size and apparent vulnerability had been psychological weapons against the first attacker. Now, she needed different tactics. The transport's endurance, defensive systems, and unexpected firepower could be turned into advantages if she played her cards correctly. Rodriguez, what's our missile inventory? Sarah asked, putting the aircraft into a climbing spiral that forced the enemy fighters to adjust their attack angles. 3 AIM-9s remaining, plus the defensive systems, Rodriguez reported. But, Captain, we're burning fuel fast with these maneuvers. We can't keep this up indefinitely. The lead enemy fighter opened fire with its 30mm cannon, tracer round streaking past Sarah's cockpit. She responded by releasing chaff and flares while diving toward the valley floor, using the terrain to break the enemy's targeting solution. The MiG pilot followed, believing he had the transport trapped in the narrow valley. What the enemy pilot didn't realize was that Sarah had been flying through this valley for months. She knew every ridge, every thermal current, and every hiding spot that could be used to tactical advantage. As the MiG committed to its dive, Sarah pulled her aircraft into a hidden canyon that was barely wide enough for the C-130's wingspan. The enemy pilot found himself trapped below the transport, unable to climb without exposing himself to Sarah's weapons. When he tried to escape the canyon by banking left, Sarah was waiting with another missile lock. The second MiG disappeared in a ball of fire and twisted metal. 2 down, Sarah reported grimly. Where are the others? Her question was answered by the distinctive whine of jet engines approaching at high speed. The remaining enemy fighters had called for reinforcements, and for more MiGs were approaching from the east. Sarah's experimental C-130 had proven it could fight, but 6-to-1 odds would test any pilot's skills. Falcon leader to Transport 77 came the radio call. We've broken through the first enemy group and are en route to assist. Hold position and try to evade until we arrive. Sarah looked at her tactical display and made a decision that would have shocked every transport pilot in military aviation. Instead of evading, she turned directly toward the approaching enemy fighters. If they wanted to fight, she would give them one they'd never forget. The C-130's experimental radar system lit up the approaching fighters, and Sarah realized she had one advantage the enemy couldn't counter. They were expecting to fight a transport aircraft, but she was flying something entirely different, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Johnson, take us to maximum power and prepare for the most unusual air combat engagement in military history, Sarah ordered. Rodriguez, arm all remaining weapons. We're going to show these pilots that being a transport flyer doesn't mean we can't fight. As the 6 remaining enemy fighters spread out for their attack, Sarah Martinez prepared to demonstrate that skill, determination, and superior technology could overcome any odds. The greatest aerial battle of her career was just beginning, and before it ended, military aviation would never be the same. The enemy pilots were about to learn that underestimating Sarah Martinez wasn't just a mistake. It was a fatal error that would cost them everything. The 6 approaching MiG-29 fighters spread into attack formation, their pilots confident they were facing a desperate transport crew making a final stand. Squadron leader Viktor Petrov had shot down 14 aircraft during his career and viewed this engagement as routine cleanup. His tactical computer showed a single, slow-moving transport aircraft flying directly toward his formation. Either the pilot was suicidal or completely inexperienced. Petrov was about to discover he was wrong on both counts. Sarah maintained her heading directly toward the enemy formation, using every second to study their approach patterns on her experimental radar system. The modified C-130's computer was analyzing each fighter's flight characteristics, speed, and maneuvering capabilities, building a tactical picture that gave her unprecedented situational awareness. "Captain, they're spreading out to surround us," Johnson reported, his hands steady on the controls despite the approaching danger. "Classic fighter intercept pattern. They're trying to force us into a killing box." "I see it," Sarah replied, watching the tactical display as the enemy fighters move to attack positions. "But they're assuming we'll react like a normal transport." "Rodriguez, what's our electronic warfare capability?" Rodriguez was learning the classified systems in real time, reading from technical manuals while monitoring multiple displays. "We have active jamming, false target generation, and something called adaptive signature masking." "Captain, according to this manual, our aircraft can make their radar systems see whatever we want them to see." Sarah smiled grimly. The enemy pilots were about to encounter 21st-century technology controlled by a pilot who understood both transport operations and tactical thinking. "Activate jamming and false targets. Let's give them something to think about." Suddenly, Petrov's radar display erupted with contacts. Where moments before he had seen one transport aircraft, his screen now showed 12 separate targets moving in impossible formations. His wingmen reported similar readings, their confident communications dissolving into confusion and concern. "Wolf Leader, we're seeing multiple contacts. Advise if friendly fighters are in the area," Petrov radioed, his tactical certainty beginning to crack. "Negative, Wolf Leader. You should have one transport aircraft. Check your systems," came the response from his ground controller. While the enemy pilots struggled with their compromised radar systems, Sarah was maneuvering her C-130 into position for an attack that would demonstrate the transport's hidden capabilities. The experimental system included a targeting computer that could track multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously while calculating optimal firing solutions. "Missile lock on the lead aircraft," Sarah announced. Fox 2, her third AM. 9 Sidewinder streaked toward Petrov's MiG, but the veteran pilot's reflexes saved him. He deployed countermeasures and pulled into a violent evasive turn that caused the missile to detonate harmlessly. However, his evasive maneuver broke up the enemy formation and scattered his wingmen across the sky. "This is impossible," Petrov muttered, staring at his radar display, which showed the transport aircraft performing maneuvers that violated everything he knew about C-130 capabilities. Transport aircraft don't carry air-to-air missiles. Sarah used the enemy's confusion to her advantage, diving toward the valley floor while activating the signature masking system. To enemy radar, her aircraft suddenly appeared to be a much smaller, faster target, something resembling a fighter aircraft rather than a lumbering transport. Two enemy fighters dove after what they believed was a fleeing target, only to find themselves chasing a ghost. The C-130's stealth modifications made it nearly invisible to radar at low altitude, while its electronic warfare systems created false echoes that led the pursuing fighters into the valley walls. The fourth and fifth enemy aircraft crashed into mountainsides while chasing targets that didn't exist. "Where did it go?" demanded Petrov, circling the valley while trying to reacquire the target that had vanished from his sensors. His remaining wingmen reported similar difficulties, their advanced fighter aircraft suddenly rendered ineffective by technology they couldn't understand. Sarah climbed back to altitude behind the confused enemy formation, using her superior radar to track each remaining fighter while they searched for her. The experimental system provided her with targeting solutions on all 4 remaining aircraft, but she had only 1 missile left. "Captain, Falcon leader reports they're 3 minutes out," Johnson announced. "Think we can hold on that long?" "We're not holding on," Sarah replied, lining up her shot on the nearest enemy fighter. "We're finishing this fight." The last AM-9 missile found its target, sending the 6th enemy aircraft spinning toward the ground in flames. Petrov and his 2 remaining wingmen suddenly realized they were facing something far deadlier than any transport pilot should have been capable of. "Break off! Break off!" Petrov ordered, finally, understanding that his squadron was being systematically destroyed by an opponent he had gravely underestimated. "This is not a normal transport aircraft." But Sarah wasn't finished. The experimental C-130 still had its defensive systems, and she had learned to use every advantage her aircraft provided. As the remaining enemy fighters tried to escape, she pursued them with determination that would have impressed any fighter pilot. Petrov's MiG was faster than the C-130, but speed wasn't everything in aerial combat. Sarah used the transport's endurance and electronic warfare capabilities to maintain contact while the enemy fighters burned fuel in desperate evasive maneuvers. Wolf leader to base, Petrov radioed frantically. Request immediate reinforcement. We are engaged with unknown aircraft type. Repeat, this is not a transport aircraft. Wolf leader, confirm you are engaging a C-130 transport. Came a skeptical reply from ground control. Negative. Whatever this aircraft is, it has shot down 6 of my fighters. It's using jamming, missiles, and maneuvers no transport should be capable of. We need backup immediately. As Petrov called for help, Sarah was setting up for her final attack. The C-130's experimental systems included one last surprise, a rapid-fire cannon system disguised as cargo bay equipment. When the enemy fighters flew into range, Sarah was ready to demonstrate that transport pilots could be every bit as deadly as their fighter counterparts. The battle was nearing its climax, and Viktor Petrov was about to learn that underestimating Captain Sarah Martinez was the last mistake his squadron would ever make. Viktor Petrov's remaining 2 wingmen were seasoned combat pilots, but they had never faced an opponent like the modified C-130. As Sarah maneuvered her transport aircraft through the mountain valley, she was rewriting the rules of aerial combat with every tactical decision. Captain, I'm reading 3 fighters still active, Rodriguez reported, monitoring multiple screens while trying to understand systems that had never been used in actual combat. But our fuel situation is getting critical. These maneuvers are burning everything we have. Sarah glanced at her fuel gauge and calculated quickly. She had enough for maybe 10 more minutes of combat maneuvering, but the approaching F-16 escorts were still 2 minutes away. 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours when facing 3 desperate enemy pilots who now understood they were fighting for their lives. Then, we finish this quickly, Sarah decided, banking the C-130 toward Petrov's formation. Rodriguez, tell me about that rapid-fire system you mentioned. It's experimental, Captain. 20mm cannon designed for close-range defense. Never been tested in actual combat conditions, Rodriguez replied, his fingers flying over unfamiliar controls. The ammunition load is limited, but the rate of fire should surprise anyone who gets too close. Petrov saw the transport turning toward his formation and couldn't believe what he was witnessing. In 20 years of flying, he had never seen a transport aircraft actively pursue fighter aircraft. Every tactical manual said it was impossible, yet here was undeniable proof that sometimes the impossible happened. This pilot is either brilliant or completely insane, Petrov muttered to his wingmen. Stay in formation and use our speed advantage. One coordinated pass should finish this. The 3 MiGs accelerated toward the C-130, their pilots finally coordinating properly for what should have been a textbook intercept. They approached from different angles to prevent the transport from targeting all of them simultaneously, using professional tactics that had worked against every opponent they had previously encountered. Sarah watched the enemy fighters commit to their attack, run, and smiled. They were flying exactly the pattern she had hoped for, concentrating on their target, while assuming the C-130 would attempt to evade. Instead, she was about to demonstrate the transport's most unexpected capability. Defensive cannon system armed and ready, Rodriguez announced. Captain, you realize we're about to engage 3 fighters in close combat with an aircraft that weighs as much as all 3 of theirs combined. Weight can be an advantage if you know how to use it, Sarah replied, adjusting her approach angle. Johnson, maximum power to engines. We're going to show these pilots that physics works both ways. The lead MiG opened fire first, its 30mm cannon sending tracers streaking toward the C-130's cockpit. Sarah responded by pulling the transport into a climbing turn that brought her directly into the path of the second attacking fighter. What happened next redefined everyone's understanding of aerial combat dynamics. The C-130's rapid-fire cannon system erupted with a sound like thunder, sending a stream of 20mm rounds directly into the path of the approaching MiG. The enemy pilot tried to evade, but he had committed to his attack run and couldn't change course quickly enough. The fighter aircraft disintegrated under the devastating firepower of the transport's defensive system. "Scratch number 7, Sarah announced grimly, swinging the heavy transport toward Petrov's aircraft. Petrov watched his wingman's fighter explode and realized he was witnessing something that would change military aviation forever. This wasn't just a lucky transport crew defending themselves. This was a systematic demonstration of superior technology and exceptional piloting skill. Wolf 3, break off and climb, Petrov ordered his last remaining wingman. We're dealing with something completely outside our experience. But Sarah wasn't giving them time to regroup. She dove the C-130 toward the valley floor, using the terrain to mask her approach while the experimental stealth systems made her aircraft nearly invisible to enemy radar. When she emerged from behind a mountain ridge, she was perfectly positioned behind the climbing MiG. The rapid-fire cannon spoke again, and the 8th enemy aircraft joined its squadron mates in fiery destruction. Petrov found himself alone, facing an opponent who had just destroyed most of his squadron using an aircraft that shouldn't have been capable of any of the maneuvers he had witnessed. His fuel gauge showed critical levels, his weapons were nearly exhausted, and his tactical situation was hopeless. "This is impossible," he whispered, staring at the C-130 that was now turning toward him with obvious hostile intent. "Transport pilots don't fly like this." Sarah heard Petrov's transmission over the emergency frequency and decided to respond. "Wolf Leader, this is Transport 77. Your squadron underestimated the wrong pilot today. You have 30 seconds to withdraw before I finish what you started." Petrov looked at his instrument panel, calculated his odds, and made the hardest decision of his military career. He had never retreated from aerial combat, but he had also never faced an opponent who had just proven that all his tactical assumptions were worthless. "Transport 77, Wolf Leader is withdrawing. You have won this engagement," Petrov transmitted, banking his MiG toward home base. As the last enemy fighter disappeared into the distance, Sarah finally allowed herself to relax. Her modified C-130 had faced 12 enemy fighters and emerged victorious, proving that exceptional pilots could overcome any odds when equipped with superior technology and unshakable determination. "Falcon Leader to Transport 77, came the familiar voice of her F-16 escort. "We just watched the most incredible aerial combat display in military history. How did you shoot down 8 fighters with a transport aircraft?" Sarah looked at the experimental control panels that had saved her life and changed everything she thought she knew about aviation combat. "Falcon Leader, sometimes being underestimated is the best weapon you can have. The enemy never saw us coming because they never believed we could fight back." As she turned the C-130 toward base, Sarah Martinez had no idea that her 24 minutes of combat had just revolutionized military thinking about transport aircraft capabilities. The woman who had been dismissed as just a transport pilot had proven that with the right equipment and exceptional skill, any aircraft could become a formidable weapon of war. The journey home would give her time to process what had happened, but Sarah already knew that her life as an underestimated transport pilot was over. From now on, everyone would know that Captain Sarah Martinez was something far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The flight back to base passed in surreal quiet after the intensity of combat. Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls, but her mind was processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 24 minutes, she had transformed from an underestimated transport pilot into someone who had achieved the impossible. "Captain, Base Control is requesting immediate priority landing clearance," Johnson reported, his voice reflecting the awe that still gripped the entire crew. They're asking for a full debrief the moment we touch down. Sarah wasn't surprised. The radio transmissions from the combat zone had undoubtedly reached every command level in the theater. 12 enemy fighters had approached her aircraft, and only one had survived to tell the story. Military intelligence would want every detail of how a transport aircraft had accomplished what an entire fighter squadron might have struggled to achieve. Rodriguez, how are our systems holding up? Sarah asked, running through post-combat diagnostics on equipment she was still learning to understand. Everything's functioning normally, Captain. The experimental systems performed beyond all specifications, Rodriguez replied, carefully documenting readings that would be crucial for future development. The engineers who designed this equipment are going to be very interested in our combat data. As the base appeared ahead, Sarah could see unusual activity on the runway. Emergency vehicles, senior officers, and technical teams were assembled in formations that suggested her arrival was being treated as a significant event. Word had clearly spread about the transport aircraft that had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The C-130 touched down smoothly, and Sarah taxied toward the designated parking area where a crowd of personnel waited. Through her cockpit window, she could see Colonel Davidson standing with several officers she didn't recognize, probably intelligence specialists and technical experts eager to understand how the experimental systems had performed. Transport 77 shut down engines and report to debriefing immediately, came the tower transmission. Outstanding work, Captain Martinez. The entire base is talking about your engagement. Sarah completed her shutdown checklist with the same methodical precision she brought to every flight, but she knew this landing marked the end of her anonymous career as a transport pilot. The woman who climbed out of the aircraft would be someone entirely different from the one who had taken off 6 hours earlier. Colonel Davidson approached as Sarah descended from the cockpit, his expression mixing professional respect with obvious amazement. Captain Martinez, I've been flying military aircraft for 25 years, and what you accomplished today defies everything I thought I knew about aviation combat. How did a transport pilot develop fighter tactics that good? Sir, I've been flying transport missions through hostile territory for 8 years, Sarah replied. You learn to think tactically when your life depends on avoiding enemy fighters. Today, I just had the tools to do something about it, instead of running. The crowd of assembled personnel parted as a general approached, someone Sarah recognized as the theater commander, though she had never spoken with him directly. General Patricia Hawkins had a reputation as one of the most tactically astute officers in the Air Force, and her presence indicated the strategic importance of what had occurred. Captain Martinez, your actions today have implications far beyond this single engagement, General Hawkins stated. You've demonstrated that our assumptions about aircraft roles and capabilities may need fundamental revision. We're going to want extensive debriefing on both your tactics and the experimental systems. Over the following hours, Sarah found herself in conference rooms with engineers, intelligence officers, and tactical specialists who wanted to understand every detail of the combat engagement. The experimental systems had recorded everything, providing data that would influence military aviation development for years to come. The enemy pilots never adapted to fighting an opponent who didn't behave like a transport aircraft, Sarah explained to the assembled experts. They approached with tactics designed for engaging helpless targets, not an aircraft capable of fighting back with sophisticated weapons and electronic warfare systems. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, the lead engineer for the experimental program, was particularly interested in how Sarah had learned to use unfamiliar systems during combat conditions. Captain, you operated equipment that took our test pilots months to master. How did you develop proficiency so quickly? The systems were intuitive, ma'am. More importantly, I understood what I was trying to accomplish tactically. The equipment just gave me tools to execute strategies I had been thinking about for years, Sarah answered. As word of the engagement spread throughout the military, Sarah began receiving visitors from unexpected places. Fighter pilots who had previously dismissed transport crews as non-combatants came to understand how tactical thinking and superior technology could overcome traditional advantages. The woman they had underestimated was now being studied as an example of exceptional military aviation. 3 weeks after the engagement, Sarah received orders transferring her to a classified program developing the next generation of military transport aircraft. Her combat experience and demonstrated ability to use experimental systems made her invaluable for testing equipment that would give future transport pilots the same advantages she had discovered. Viktor Petrov, the enemy pilot who had survived the engagement, eventually provided intelligence that confirmed Sarah's tactical assessment. His debriefing reports described an opponent who had systematically destroyed his squadron using superior technology and exceptional piloting skills that had overcome every advantage his fighters possessed. The pilot we engaged was not a normal transport crew, Petrov had reported to his commanders. This was someone who understood fighter tactics, but flew an aircraft we had never encountered. Our intelligence about transport capabilities was completely wrong. Years later, when military historians analyzed the engagement, they would identify it as a turning point in aviation combat doctrine. Sarah Martinez had proven that exceptional pilots could transcend the limitations of their aircraft when equipped with appropriate technology and tactical understanding. The woman who had been dismissed as just a transport pilot became a legend in military aviation circles. Her 24 minutes of combat had demonstrated that being underestimated was often the enemy's greatest mistake, and that true tactical excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places. Captain Sarah Martinez had shown the world that heroes weren't always found where people expected to look, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones nobody saw coming. Her legacy would inspire future generations of pilots who understood that labels meant nothing when skill, determination, and superior technology combined in the hands of someone exceptional enough to use them properly. In the end, the enemy's fatal error wasn't tactical or technical. It was assuming that a transport pilot couldn't be every bit as deadly as any fighter pilot they had ever faced.